Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to South Brunswick Library and the second in our series, Tea and History. Today we are going to focus on the historic center of Kingston. And you and I are privileged to be here at the premiere showing of the brand new videotape, Kingston, Crossroads to History. So brand new that it was finished about 15 minutes ago. I kid you not. And for that, I want to thank Ms. Ann Zeman and Mr. Jim Brody for their efforts in putting it together. And believe me, they worked long and hard to do this, and you are going to enjoy it very much. I'm sure. Before we get started, I would like to thank the library board and the library director, Ms. Lorraine Jackson, for allowing me to coordinate this program and bring this information to you. And I would like to thank Friends of the Library for providing the refreshments for us today. I'd like to thank Mr. Ken Kirsch and his staff for videotaping us and making it available to Channel 3 for other people in South Brunswick. And I would certainly like to thank Viji Sivatri, who has done our handouts for us. She is our graphics artist on the library staff, and she has been very generous to us with her time also. Now, I would like to thank especially our presenters. We have Robert von Zumbusch and Ann Zeman. Robert is an architect who lives and works in the Kingston Mill, which many of you know is right over the bridge between Kingston and Princeton. And if you ever wondered who lived there, now you know. Robert is the vice chair of the Kingston Historical Society and also the Kingston Greenways Association. And he's also a member of the Joint Task Force for the Village of Kingston. Anne is the educational chair and archivist for the Kingston Historical Society, and she is a member of the Kingston Garden Club. She is a member of the Kingston Task Force, the Joint Task Force, and she's also the vice chair of the Middlesex County Water Resources Association. Past president of the League of Women Voters. She writes books. She has authored several, and her latest script is the one that we will hear today behind the videotape. So I welcome Robert and Ann. And now, I'm sorry. I'm Ellen Gambatese, and I tell you that I am the wife of Deputy Mayor Frank Gambatese because it is he who called to my attention all the knowledgeable and wonderful people in our township who are part of the Historic Preservation Committee. And I said to him after hearing his news when he comes home from many meetings, that this is something we have to get to the broader community. So being a member of the library board, I approached them and asked if I could do this program, and they were only too happy to have it done. So we welcome you, and we can start with our program, except that I hear somebody knocking at the door. If you'll excuse me just a minute. Whoops. Whoops. This doesn't want to. It does. Oh, let me go. You won't believe this. What a stroke of luck. Who do we have here?
My name is George, and I'm a citizen of Kingston, and I apologize for my late arrival. However, the roads were a little muddy today from the rain last night, and my horse and I had a little bit of difficulty making it here. Well, I hope you will excuse that and welcome me here.
George, I'm sorry for the difficulty in your getting here, but I'm certainly glad to have you. Welcome aboard, and you're going to see this brand new video today, too. So why don't you have a seat next to Ann, and we'll begin. Ann?
There is one person left out of the thank yous, and that is Ellen Gambatese. And Ellen is the one that had the idea for these 5 historical lectures. And she has worked literally day and night on the phone in this room, cajoling all of us, encouraging all of us, and I'd like to personally thank her. She's done a terrific job. Thank you, Ellen. I am very privileged to introduce to you, as Ellen mentioned, a brand new off-the-press video, and it is entitled Kingston, the Crossroads to History. And it's entitled that basically because you might remember a couple years ago, Kingston celebrated its 325th anniversary, as well as the 75th anniversary of the Kingston Volunteer Fire Company. So we had basically a year-long presentation that culminated in a wonderful parade in the summer in August, and we did a terrific booklet that celebrated our anniversary. When we thought that was such a good title, we're continuing with that. It also is relevant because Kingston is a crossroads. It was a crossroads to the Revolution. It was a crossroads between New York and the Delaware River. In fact, Route 27, also known as the King's Highway, was originally an Indian trail that was widened and became the basic road between New York and Philadelphia, of which Kingston is virtually right in the middle. So we are at crossroads for transportation and a lot of historical events. About a year and a half ago, it was, I believe, at the suggestion of then the chair of the Historic Preservation Task Force for South Brunswick, Mr. Glenn Davis, who suggested to the task force, if we're going to have a task force, we really should find out and introduce ourselves to all the villages and hamlets of South Brunswick. And he had each of us, Kingston and Monmouth Junction and Dayton and Deans, all come in and give a presentation to the task force. Well, Mr. Gambatese was so excited. He said, "You've got to do a video. We've got to tell the entire town about this." And it was that launched this particular video. Now, is Jim Boyd still here? Mr. Jim Boyd, I'd like to recognize him because without Jim, he has done a terrific job. He has worked so hard on this. As Ellen mentioned, it only finished just a few minutes ago because he's a perfectionist. It's never going to be the way he wants, and that's the way creative people always are. But Jim... I haven't seen it yet. Anyway, a very, very special thanks to Jim. And I think Jim is right. Without further ado, let's see Kingston, Crossroads to History.
Hello, I'm Frank Gambatese, Deputy Mayor of South Brunswick Township and a member of the Township's Historic Preservation Task Force. The program you are about to see is about the place you call home, South Brunswick Township and its historic villages, hamlets, and crossroads. Kingston, Monmouth Junction, Dayton, Deans, Little Rocky Hill, and Fresh Ponds have a special place in South Brunswick Township's history. This video series explores the people, places, and events that shaped our township, a history that goes back hundreds of years to pre-revolutionary colonial America. Sitting in the comfort of your car, zipping along Route 1 past gas stations and shopping centers, it's hard to imagine a time when people traveled the same route, on foot or on horseback, a time when goods moved by wagon and canal barge, and the trip from New York to Philadelphia took 3 days by stagecoach. For most of its history, South Brunswick's economy was based primarily on agriculture. Today, thousands of people drive to jobs in modern office buildings on corporate campuses, built on land that was farmed as recently as a generation ago. Why remember South Brunswick's history? Because we wouldn't enjoy the lives we do today if not for the hard work of those who went before us. They fought for independence and they set about building a country. They cleared the land. They built farms and mills and main streets, established banks and trade. They created the public institutions and laws that made democracy possible. They built the churches we worship in, put up schools and libraries, and formed fire companies. These things we take for granted didn't happen by themselves, and they serve our needs today because of the tenacity ingenuity, enterprise, and the courage of the men and women who founded and built historic communities of South Brunswick Township. This video tells their story.
Kingston is one of the oldest communities in New Jersey. Located almost exactly midway between New York and Philadelphia, it was a natural resting place for travelers. And the earliest accounts of Kingston Village in travelers' journals show the village to be over 325 years old. The King's Highway, chartered in 1697 as the first major road to connect the original 13 colonies, passed right down the middle of the village. The highway divided Kingston in two, with South Brunswick Township in Middlesex County on the east side of the highway, and Franklin Township in Somerset County on the west side. With its southern portion jutting over the Mercer County line to the banks of the Millstone River, Kingston was and still is the only village in New Jersey to lie in 3 counties. Kingston is a village rich in history. During the American Revolution, British and American troops marched through Kingston. George Washington made a key tactical decision while resting in Kingston, and during a session of the Continental Congress of 1783, set up headquarters at Rockingham, a farmhouse on the outskirts of Kingston Village. Its location made Kingston a hub of transportation and commerce. The Delaware and Raritan Canal and the Camden and Amboy Railroad fueled Kingston's growth in the 1800s and into the 1900s. When the canal closed in the early 1930s and commercial activity moved east to U.S. Route 1, Kingston settled into the role of small village. It has retained its charming character and small-town appeal for the last 100 years. Kingston's historic importance is well recognized, with 5 entries on the National Register of Historic Places, including the Delaware and Raritan Canal, the Withington Estate, now Heathcote Farm, the Kingston Mill Historic District, and the Kingston Village Historic District, along with the Lake Carnegie Historic District. Its most recent historic designation came in the year 2000, when a 10-mile stretch of the original King's Highway was named to the National Register. To begin Kingston's long history, we have to go back to colonial times. We know that a small village of Kingstown, named to honor the British Crown, existed as early as 1675, from its mention in a journal kept by a traveler along the Old Dutch Trail. For the first 100 years of the town's existence, Kingston was better known than its neighbor to the west, Princeton. Only after the establishment of a college in 1750 did Princeton become an important destination. As early as 1683, Europeans like Dr. Henry Greenland, a physician who built a house and operated a tavern near the Kingston Bridge, were settling in the village. It was at Dr. Greenland's house that the Keith Line, also known as the Province Line Agreement, was signed in 1686, establishing a boundary line between East and West New Jersey. By 1705, a wooden bridge had been erected over the Millstone River, and the village began to grow. Here, along the Old Post Road, the Sheriff of Somerset, a man named Barefoot Brinson, who was a grandson of Henry Greenland, opened a general store. Brinson is believed to have built the first flour mill on a tributary of the Millstone. According to the 1735 tax list, Kingston also had a sawmill on the Millstone River, as well as a blacksmith shop and 2 inns. By the mid-1700s, Kingston was becoming well known as a stage rest and stopping place for travelers making the journey between New York and Philadelphia, a trip that could take 3 days to complete. The village was also a stopping place for the post riders who ran mail 3 times weekly between New York and Philadelphia. The run took 33 hours, and the postmen met at the halfway point in Kingston to exchange mail coming from the other direction. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence came from Kingston. His name was Joseph Hughes. Hughes was born in 1730 at Mayberry Hill, the family homestead on Snowden Lane, which was then considered part of Kingston. As Kingston grew, its first church was soon established. The Presbyterian Church at Kingston traces its history to 1723, when the first congregation was organized. A simple log church was erected in 1732 on the site where the present-day Presbyterian Cemetery overlooks the Millstone River. A fire destroyed the log church in 1791, and a second frame building was erected. The congregation worshiped here until 1852, when a larger church was built further north on the Kings Highway. The Presbyterian Cemetery, on the site of the original church, is the final resting place of many who settled Kingston during the 18th and 19th centuries, including the Gulicks, Withingtons, Bales, and Bastedos. Kingston was at a crossroads of the Revolutionary War. After the fall of Fort Lee in November 1776, Washington and his troops retreated south through New Jersey, closely pursued by the British. On December 3rd, Washington's troops rested in Kingston on their way to Trenton, where, on Christmas Eve, they would score a decisive victory against Hessian mercenaries and camped across the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. On January 3rd, 1777, again on the march after the Battle of Princeton, George Washington and the Continental Army, with British prisoners in tow, regrouped in Kingston. They destroyed the stone bridge over the Millstone, which had been built in 1738, in order to slow the pursuit of the British. It was here that Washington stopped to make a critical decision. During his famous Conference on Horseback in the Presbyterian Cemetery, Washington elected to turn his troops toward Rocky Hill rather than proceeding to Brunswick, where Cornwallis expected him to advance. General Washington and his troops spent the following winter at Valley Forge. In early summer, they crossed the river at Lambertville and marched on to Kingston, where they camped en route to the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778.
The mood of the troops is much different. The battles of Trenton and Princeton have been fought and won. And it's at this time that General Washington, along with his other generals, meet on horseback in the Kingston Presbyterian Church Cemetery to discuss their tactics. It's at this time that he has his troops dismantle and destroy the bridge that was built in 1738 over the Millstone River. His decision as to whether he should go on to New Brunswick and capture the British stores and quartermaster's payroll, or move on up the Millstone Valley. It is decided that his troops are just too tired and worn out to continue the trip into New Brunswick, and so he retires to winter quarters in Morristown by following the Millstone River up into Somerset Courthouse and eventually into Morristown.
The Kingston Mill on the Millstone River played an important role in the life of the town. Built in the 1740s, the mill operated as a business continuously for over 200 years. When the Gulick family purchased the mill around 1800, it was used primarily to grind wheat. But the enterprising Gulicks rented out sections of the mill to independent operators for cloth and lumber manufacturing. The mill's largest business successes came as it met heavy demand for grain and flour during the War of 1812. In February 1888, the original Kingston Mill burned down. A new mill was rebuilt on the site in 1889 by Nelson Thompson, who ran the business, delivering flour by horse-drawn carriage. Kingston continued to be an important crossroads into the 19th century. In the early 1800s, the construction of the Delaware and Raritan Canal would have a great effect on the life of Kingston. The canal system connected the busy Delaware River at Bordentown, near Trenton, with the Raritan River at New Brunswick. 44 miles long, 75 feet wide, and 8 feet deep, the D&R Canal greatly eased the transportation of goods between New York and Philadelphia by eliminating ocean travel. Work on the canal began in Kingston in 1830. Irish immigrants made up most of the workforce. They dug the canal by hand using shovels and picks, aided only by horses and mule-drawn scoops. By 1833, the southern half of the canal was opened. The first boat to make the trip from Trenton to Kingston was cheered on by bystanders who lined up along the canal to witness the event. The canal was completed and opened officially in May 1834. There were 14 locks on the D&R Canal. Lock number 8 was located at Kingston, along with a toll office. One of the first telegraph offices was also established here in 1846. The telegraph office monitored canal traffic and water levels. Most of the canal traffic was mule-drawn barges hauling coal from Pennsylvania to New York. The toll rate for raw freight, such as coal, sand, or timber, was 2 cents per ton per mile. Tolls were collected at the toll house. Traffic on the canal began to rise sharply by 1840, and at its peak in 1866, the D&R was handling more volume than the Erie Canal. Besides the barges, the canal was used by sloops, schooners, and steamers. A railroad station was built on the eastern side of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which served as a terminus for a single-track spur to Monmouth Junction, the main line of the Camden and Amboy. The Rocky Hill Railroad and Transportation Company constructed a spur of the Camden and Amboy that ran 3 miles from Kingston to the Atlantic Terracotta Company between Rocky Hill and Griggstown in 1864. A common practice prior to free education was to educate children in religious or private schools. The first school in Kingston was founded in 1725 and was part of the Presbyterian Church.
Education in colonial times certainly wasn't mandatory and wasn't regular. Attendance was just whoever showed up on any given day. Girls were allowed to go to school, which was nice. It wasn't just boys, and so the teacher would never know how many of her students would be there on any given day.
The Kingston Free School was built in 1871 on the corner of Main Street and Academy Street. Although it no longer houses a school, the building still overlooks the Presbyterian Cemetery. A new Somerset school was built in 1920 on Laurel Avenue and served children on the western side of Kingston.
It has one of the oldest libraries, public-type libraries in the state, as far as I know. It's certainly older again than Princeton's library. They had a lending library, and you could buy for $1 a year a membership, and they had, beginning with 250 books, and people later donated books as they moved, and it grew.
At their peak, between 1850 and 1900, the canal and rail lines brought a small boom to Kingston. Stores were built, and businesses prospered along the main street. Of course, Kingston's inns and taverns thrived. One of the most popular was owned by the Withington family. Phineas Withington ran the inn as early as 1811 out of the Withington homestead, directly across the street from the Presbyterian Church. In 1842, Isaac Chandler Withington inherited the family interests, including the homestead and 200 acres of farmland. In 1850, Isaac Withington sold 75 acres of his farm to the state of New Jersey to build a house of refuge for young boys. the state began erecting a large building made of Trenton brownstone, shipped by barge up the canal to Kingston from the capital. But the state ran out of money and put the property up for auction in 1857. Withington repurchased the land and finished the building, a 3-story Italianate mansion. Among Kingston's many historic buildings, the Withington Estate is perhaps the grandest. A Kingston Methodist church was organized in 1878, inspired by an evangelist, Miss Lizzie Sharp, who conducted revival meetings in nearby Rocky Hill. After hearing Miss Sharp, 30 Kingston residents formed a congregation on April 11, 1878, and resolved to build a church. The lot where the church stands today was purchased for $250. In 1882, the population of Kingston was estimated at 500 people. But already the canal was beginning to lose business to the railroads. Although big industry may have been in short supply, many small businesses, hotels, and taverns still prospered in the village. The Hoffman House Hotel sat next to the canal until February 19, 1910, when the Princeton Press reports that fire destroyed the historic old landmark. Luther Anthony ran a store across the street from the Union Line Hotel. Later, so did B.S. Peebles. J.S. Wolfe's boot and shoemaker shop sat next to the old post office on the Franklin side of Main Street. Wolfe's son, George, was Kingston's postmaster from 1897 through 1914. Today, the property is home of Lou's Barbershop and the Syncax, who have lived here for more than 40 years.
I opened the shop in '49, and I loved every minute I've had so far. Everybody gave me almost anything I got in here. Anything you see here is a gift from one of my customers. Came here when I was 12 years old, and I would like to see, more than anything, the people in town be acquainted with the organizations that we have here. There's so much to offer here in town that I think this Kingston initiative did so much. And your society, the historians, the garden clubs, the fire companies, the first aid squad.
Just as canal and rail commerce was slowing, a new business arrived in Kingston, lured, ironically, by convenient access to the canal and rail lines. William Flemmer Sr. purchased the 68-acre Myrick Farm on Mapleton Road in 1913 and started Princeton Nurseries. Over the next 70 years, Princeton Nurseries would grow to become the largest commercial nursery east of the Mississippi. William Flemmer Sr. acquired hundreds of acres in the Kingston area and put it into cultivation. At about the same time that William Flemmer was getting his nursery operations off the ground, the Reverend Thomas H. Whiteside organized the Kingston Improvement Association to secure lights for the village in 1913. After lighting the village, the Improvement Association continued to work to bring services to the village, including the first fire company.
Kingston Volunteer Fire Company was formed in 1924. This was as a result of a tragic fire that occurred on Main Street involving Smilkstein's dry goods store and the Burley home and the Potts family home that was destroyed on February 17, 1924, early in Sunday morning. Because of this fire, the fire company was organized quickly. In February 29, 1924 was our organizing meeting, and by April 30th of 1924, the fire company was incorporated. And by July of that same year, our first fire truck was delivered on a flatbed rail car at the Kingston train station at the bottom of the hill. That was a 1924 American LaFrance triple pumper on a Brockway chassis.
I'm Jim Luck, and I'm the Assistant Chief of the Kingston Fire Company. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce you to some of our members that have served for more than 50 years. First is Norman Luck Sr. Second is James McDonald Jr. Third is Carl Eisman. Fourth is Leslie Luck Jr. And finally is Charlie Petrillo. Charlie has in excess of 65 years of service to our community.
3 years later, in January 1927, the Kingston Ladies Auxiliary was formed by Catherine Matthews. Much of the fire company's budget came from the fundraising efforts of the Ladies Auxiliary.
The Ladies Auxiliary was started, as far as I can remember, about 1927, and we worked to help the firemen get different equipment and things that they need to run their organization. We try to help them as much as we can.
The area west and north of the village has been quarried for well over 100 years. An engraving from 1872 advertising stone from Howell's Quarry, Martin A. Howell proprietor, depicts mule-drawn barges hauling stone down the Delaware and Raritan Canal from Rocky Hill to Kingston. The New Jersey Industrial Directory of 1909 listed the Delaware River Quarry Company with 300 employees and noted that 250 were Italians. By 1930, it was renamed Kingston Trap Rock Quarry and had been modernized with cranes, trucks, and crushing equipment for the expanding market of crushed stone. Today, from its headquarters in Kingston, Trap Rock's quarry overlooking the DNR Canal is just one of many it owns and operates throughout the United States. Although Kingston Trap Rock, Princeton Nurseries, a local bottling company run by the Catelli family, and the local greenhouse operations of Van Voorhees and Wheeler thrived, traffic along the canal continued to decline. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had always viewed the canal as a competitor, purchased the DNR in 1932 and closed down the canal operation soon after. It was the end of an era. During each period of its history, Kingston built homes in the prevailing style of the times. Today, a rich and charming range of architectural styles are still in evidence. Most of the buildings situated on Kingston's cozy, tree-lined streets are of wood frame construction, usually 2 1/2 stories, 2 or 3 bays wide, with gabled roofs. There are historic homes in the Georgian, Greek Revival, and Italianate styles, Colonial Revival, and Queen Anne. Later, notable 20th century bungalows and prairie-style houses were added to Kingston's simple townscape of well-built farm, town, and manor houses. After surviving the British Army, countless fires, and the inevitable reversals of changing economics, Kingston, like so many of New Jersey's historic crossroads towns and villages, is now fighting to preserve its history and character in the face of sprawling suburban development.
So the probably largest problem that Kingston welcomed in the colonial days was the increasing traffic of business and produce. Now has become a threat, actually, to maintaining the village atmosphere.
Well, I've had a great life in Kingston. I mean, I had 2 great parents that raised me here in town, and I just, the friendships that I've made with neighbors and folks of the town.
As I said before, there's no strangers in town. They're just friends that they haven't met. And I always said that if you walk down the path and put your hand out, you're going to meet a lot of people that there's a lot of love in Kingston.
At a time when subdivisions of hundreds of houses spring up at once, it is worth remembering, preserving, and protecting places like Kingston, whose homes and businesses were built one by one, each with its own unique story.
Mr. Boyd, please take a bow. That was excellent. Mr. Jim Boyd. Very good. Also special
Ann
thanks.
Zeman, please take a bow for that script.
Edited by Mark Peel. Also special thanks to Deputy Mayor Frank Gambatese. Thank you so much for pushing us through. Glenn Davis as co-chair. There's Glenn over there. He's chair. He has stepped down, but he was an instrument behind this from the very beginning. And everyone on the task force. So thank you all very, very much. So we're going to take a break now? Yes, we'll take a break, let you enjoy the beautiful photographs from Kingston, many that are in the video, and many you'll see again in a few minutes, but do enjoy taking a look at those. So stick around, we have more. Thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And because we advertised our program from 2 to 3:30, and it's a couple of minutes after 3, we'd like to get our program started again. So I will turn the program over to Mr. Robert von Zumbush, who lives in that mill house that we saw prominently displayed in the video. And I'm sure he has many interesting things to tell you and could tell you many more, except that we are running short on time. So, Robert?
Thank you very much. We're going to start with a few slides here, and could we lower the lights a little bit maybe so we could, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to show the map of the general Kingston area, and I apologize because actually in historic times Kingston extended on the other side of Route 1 as well, and it extended partway toward Monmouth Junction, and a number of people historically were associated with Kingston who lived on what is now the other side of Route 1. Just one of the things that's over here is an aerial view of Kingston, and I'm sorry that it isn't larger, but you can see some of the principal features of Kingston lying on the Millstone River, which was critical. Also, you can see that it is on a plateau, a slight plateau above the river, which sets it apart from the surrounding land around it. And you can see the farmland that surrounds the village, or surrounded it, and to some extent still does. A lot of the land still remains. We've been fortunate that until recently there hasn't been quite the threat that other areas have had. You can see the D&R Canal running along the river, and you can also see the outline of the original Camden and Amboy branch line, which was reached Kingston in 1839. And the canal, as you heard before, was opened in 1834. But the original impetus and the settlement of Kingston really came not from the canal or the railroad, but rather from the highway. And as has been mentioned before, being halfway approximately between New York and Philadelphia, and in a line that connected what's known as the fall lines between the river of the Raritan River and the Delaware River at Trenton, the area beyond which ships could not proceed, and the area at which it was easy to cross the river. And it also followed the Assunpink Trail of the Indians, and over the years it evolved into a major roadway, a post road, and it connected all of the it connected all the colonies, ran through, and at an early time it was declared a King's Highway, and this became the major route between Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and that led to the creation of inns. The first inn was built by Henry Greenland, and actually is in this section on the other side of the Millstone River, right about in here. And the house is still standing. It's engulfed by a much larger house now. And it was in this house that the Keith Line Agreement was signed. And it was at this point that the settlement of Kingston really started. As time went on, more and more inns were built, and they were built up on the plateau. I think we can go to the next. Yeah, thanks. Here is the area of the original mill, the crossing and the mill. The first mill was built in the 1740s, and that was built by Barefoot Brinson. He was then passed through a number of different hands. During the Revolutionary War period, the building was burned down, presumably by the British, and it was rebuilt. And the second mill was the one that burned down in 1888. The mill served as a mill until 1943, and it was not the first mill in the Kingston area. The first one was, well, here, this is the stone on the bridge. It indicates that it's approximately halfway between Philadelphia and New York, and that it was this bridge, the stone bridge, was built in 1798. There's another picture of the bridge. This is the Greenland House. The original portion of the house is actually embedded in this wing here. This is a later wing built shortly after the Revolutionary War. The Kingston Mill Pond here. And Heathcote Brook runs very nearby, and the first mill was actually built by Thomas Leonard on Heathcote's Brook, actually just off was Mapleton Road even then, and right where the bridge that's being replaced is. This just shows, this is from Heathcote's Brook looking up into Kingston, and one can see the hill that rises up to the plateau on which the village itself is centered. And this is the area of the canal area, which was a bustling commercial area during the canal period. That's another view up the hill, and you can see the new road that has come in here. This is the old road, the road that was the King's Highway. This is the road of the new bridge. Main Street, and the last of the inns and taverns left is the old Union Line. Another view of that, and another, as time developed, the King's Highway also became part of the first cross-continental paved road, the Lincoln Highway, which was cobbled together from a number of different roads, existing roads, including what is now 27. And at that time, gas stations are put in. That's what remains of what had been a gas station at one time. This you've seen before. This is the Withington House, and the land in front of it has been preserved. The Cook family gave it to the state of New Jersey, and it's the Cook Preserve. And this is part of this green belt, and here's a picture of the house itself. The green belt, which essentially surrounds Kingston and has preserved it and preserved its character over the years. And this historical context of the town is something which very few towns have left. Kingston's very fortunate in having that. This is a view from the Withington Estate into the Cook Preserve, and you can see this beautiful green belt that surrounds it. Another element of the green belt is the Princeton Nursery land. This is Mapleton Road, a very old road. It was shown already in 1745 on the earliest map, which was done by John Dally, who lived in Kingston. And this is open land on either side, up to now. This is a typical house on Heathcote, which is similar to a farmhouse, showing its relation to the open space around it. This is part of the Princeton Nursery land. The canal lies beyond those trees, the open space. On the other side in Franklin Township, on the other side of Route 27, is Rockingham. And this is where George Washington stayed for several months during the Continental Congress, and it is now being moved to a new location that is closer to its original location. This is the Kingston Lock and the toll keepers and telegraph station to the right. The canal was one of those major transportation elements that helped create Kingston. The railroad was another major development. The original Camden and Amboy Railway went from Camden to Amboy, but was extended to Trenton and then on to New Brunswick by the branch line, which ran along the DNR Canal, basically running here until it came to Kingston, where it turned just before the plateau and went to Monmouth Junction and then up to New Brunswick. In 1864, it was realigned to straighten the line, and basically what is now the Northeast Corridor line was the route of the new alignment. And the only part that remained was the little Kingston branch. This is Red Maple Farm, which is on Raymond Road. One of the major developments in Kingston was also the building of what is now Route 1, which was the New Brunswick and Trenton Turnpike in 1804, and soon after there was a drastic drop in the business of the inns in Kingston and Princeton, and several people involved with those got together, particularly the Gulick family, and had a new turnpike chartered, the Kingston-Princeton Branch Turnpike, which basically created Raymond Road, then used the old Kings Highway, and went through Princeton, and then, if you're familiar with Mercer Street, created Mercer Street to Trenton, and that brought back some of the business. That was created in 1811 and 12. Raymond Road, the first one was Red Maple Farm, which dates to 1740. This house is across the street, the Bayless House. Red Maple Farm was also associated with the Underground Railroad. And the railroad that ran along the canal, the railroad itself, was one of the routes used in the Underground Railway. And tradition has it that Red Maple Farm was one of the stations. This is another old road, is Ridge Road. And this is an old Greek Revival house on Ridge Road, which lies very close to Route 1. There are a number of old houses in the Ridge Road area, which is essentially along here. This is Mapleton, on Mapleton Road. It's also the house that the Flemmer family lived in and still lives in. This dates to the 1740s as well, and rumor has it that was shelled by the British at one point during a skirmish, and that there are remains of a cannonball on the wall. Another element of the open space which surrounds Kingston and helps define it is Lake Carnegie, which runs right alongside Princeton Nursery. And this was created around the turn of the century to provide a crew course for Princeton University, and it is on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is looking from the dam back toward, over the mill pond toward the mill and the houses in the Kingston Mill District, which is another one of the historic districts in Kingston. Let me just show you. Basically, the Kingston Village Historic District extends along the Old Kings Highway, and right centered here. Heathcote Farm is here. The Cook Preserve is around it. And the Kingston Mill District is on the other side of the canal. Basically, one can the DNR Canal runs along here. Here's Lake Carnegie. And the Kingston Highway, the Kings Highway runs through here. All of which really helped determine the history of Kingston in its early formation and generated Kingston. That's it.
Thank you very much, Robert and Ann. That was very well done, as always, and we appreciate that, and I'm sure all of us learned something this afternoon from that. And now I'm curious to hear if George has any comments, because he's been around Kingston for a very long time, and I'm sure that he learned a few things, too, about the modern day. But I'll turn it over to him, and we'll see what he has to say.
I have no idea what that thing is. But I sure don't want to touch it. I want to thank you for having me here today. I was born August the 6th, 1766, and I can tell you some of the history direct as it occurred in Kingston. But I want to take you back first to the beginnings of Kingston, 1675, when early travelers such as William Edmondson and Jasper Dankers note Kingston as they traveled through the area. By 1683, our first known settler, Dr. Henry Greenland, has arrived. He is established. He opens his homestead in a tavern. And in 1686, the Keith Line Agreement is signed in Greenland's home, which is going to be the boundaries between West and East Jersey. The village continues to grow because it is the midpoint between New York and Philadelphia. And so lots of travelers begin going back and forth between our two major cities. In 1701, the road is already widened. The Assunpink Trail has been widened in order to handle coaches and wagons so the travelers can make entrance back and forth. 1705, we have a wooden bridge built across the Millstone River in order that the wagons can get across easier. Another early settler arrives by 1709, and it's Jedediah Higgins. And he starts his homestead with his building in 1714. It is said, I've been told, that he bought 1,000 acres of land from the Lenape Indians for a sow and a litter of pigs. But I've also been told that he bought his property. But I am sure 200 years from now, it will make a nice legend. We have early mills beginning because Kingston is a farm town, farm community, and there's farms surrounding our village. We have a mill shortly after 1733 on Heathcott Brook. It's a grain and also a sawmill. And by 1755, there's a mill that is established right across the bridge on the Millstone River. Presbyterian Church is organized in 1723. I'm now a member of that church. In 1832, there's a church building up on the top of the hill overlooking the Millstone River. And the Reverend Eleazar Wales is our pastor. And he serves from 1732 to 1750. And Reverend Wales is very instrumental in the formation of the Presbytery of New Brunswick in 1738. In 1791, a terrible thing happens to our church. It's destroyed by fire, which is a very common thing in colonial America. But God, in His providence, sends us a new pastor, the Reverend Stephen Voorhees. And in 1792, in his ordination service to become the pastor of our church, the Reverend John Witherspoon delivers the ordination sermon. And it's during Reverend Voorhees' time that a new church is built on the foundation of the church that was destroyed by fire, again on the top of the hill. It's a large wood-framed structure. We have large square pews on outer sides of the church. We have large windows so that the sunlight can come in, and galleries on all three sides of the church. Reverend Voorhees passes away in 1796, and he's buried right outside one of those windows in the cemetery that surrounds the church. The oldest legible stone is that of Deborah Whitehead, who departed this life 1756. Under Reverend Voorhees' time, this church is built, but now we have a new pastor, and his name is Reverend David Comfort. He came to us in 1800, and today in 1810 he is still our pastor. He's a pious man, and he's devoted to the work of the gospel. And he's faithful and patient in his work. And I invite you on the next Sabbath to join me in church and listen to the Reverend Comfort. I am sure you will be inspired. The inns and taverns of which I work in one as a little boy, as a stable hand. The early taverns, the first one was in 1740. It was known as the Black Lion, and it's built by Mr. Leonard. The gentleman I work for is William Van Tilburg, and he has a tavern, and this tavern is called the Sign of the Mermaid, and I enjoy working there for him. There's also a tavern known as the Beehive Inn, which is prior to our War for Independence that's established. These taverns are the focal point of our community. The post riders are bringing mail every few days from Philadelphia and New York, and they exchange in Kingston. So we are privy to all the news of what's happening throughout the colonies. And we hear different stories of tea parties in Boston and the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. And I get to talk to the post riders because I help them with the horses, and I put them in the stable and I clean up after them, and they take new horses, fresh horses, to ride back and forth. The taverns are bustling with politics and talking. And as you sit in the corner and listen, you hear all kinds of things, those in favor of independence, those that are more partial to stay with the king. But things are happening. And we're getting closer and closer to the 1770s, which absolutely brings us new construction. There's new homes being built in the 1770s and 1780s along the main road between New York and Philly in our village. But as a young man, I remember December the 3rd, 1776. We are at war. As you probably have heard, there was a Declaration of Independence signed on July the 4th, 1776. And our village is going to be right in the center of it. Matter of fact, one of our original inhabitants who was born in Kingston, Joseph Hughes, signs the Declaration of Independence. But he's living in North Carolina now, and he represents them. But let me tell you, when these troops come into town on December 3rd, the looks in their eyes, there's despair, discouragement, they're dragging. I think the cause is lost. There is no way we can stand up to the British government and the forces of the king. These men are dragging along, but there's one man on a horse sitting high in the saddle. It's His Excellency, General George Washington. And he's inspiring and encouraging his men to continue down the road. You see, they've just been beaten in the battles of Fort Washington and Fort Lee along the Hudson. And he's trying to get them across New Jersey and onto the safe side of the other side of the Delaware. They are beaten people. You can tell in their way they walk, dragging along. Their spirits are broken. And I do think the cause of liberty is done. However, I will see these troops again, January 3rd, 1777. I'm sitting behind the church in the corner, just trying to hear what's going on, because His Excellency is on his horse again with other generals surrounding him, and he's in the cemetery, and he's overlooking the Millstone River. And the reason he's doing that is he's got his troops and they're dismantling the stone bridge that was built in 1738. And he's taking the planks and they're burning it. I'm not sure what's going on, but I later find out that the Battle of Princeton has been won and the battles of Trenton, and Washington is leading his troops away from the British. Prior to that battle, as the British had come through Kingston into Princeton, they put Hessian troops in homes in Kingston. They quartered these people, these mercenaries from Germany, in our homes. And we suffered greatly because of that. But now there's a new walk in the troops, and there's a new spirit because of these victories. Washington, I can overhear him talking with his generals, and it's about what to do next. They've won in Princeton. Do we continue into New Brunswick, where the quartermaster is, and the money for the British government, and all his stores and extra equipment? Or do we go left and head up into the mountains? Well, Washington decides that his troops are just too tired. They've had a hard 10 days of fighting with no rest and forced marches. And he knows his men need the rest. So he heads up the Millstone River and into Somerset Courthouse, and then eventually to winter encampment in Morristown. But we're not done with the revolution in Kingston, because in 1778, the Council of Safety from our Congress meets, because our residents have filed grievances against the enemy, the British, for all the damage they did to us prior to the Battle of Princeton. And some of our leading citizens have put in grievances. Joshua Higgins has put in a grievance of 176 pounds, 12 shillings. And my proprietor, my boss, Master Van Tilburg, has put in 7 pounds and 10 shillings, because taken from him were 5 maps of 4 quarters of the world and globe. I guess the British needed to figure out how to get around our area. So we do suffer greatly. But June 25th, 1778, our troops are back in Kingston. They have come in after winter encampment in Valley Forge. They've come down through Lambertville and Hopewell and Rocky Hill, and they've arrived in our village again. And they set up a recruiting station. And Washington sets up his headquarters. I actually try to recruit, but my mother won't have any sign of me signing on. And she kind of grabs me out of the line, says I'm too young, but I'm already 11. But Washington at this time sends a letter from Kingston to the Marquis de Lafayette, and he appoints him in command of all the troops currently in the field. Well, the field ends up being the Battle of Monmouth, because Washington is trying to bring his troops across to cut off General Howe, who's trying to make his way from Philadelphia to New York. And they meet that very hot day in June. We see Washington again visit us in 1783. The Continental Congress is meeting in the College of New Jersey in Nassau Hall. And Washington comes into town on several occasions with his guard troops leading the way, the dragoons on their horses in splendid uniform, and Mistress and Mr. Washington in carriage. And they eat at our tavern. And on several occasions he does this during the 3 or 4 months that he stays at Rockingham, just outside of Rocky Hill. And we are quick to learn the good news, because we have a treaty. The Treaty of Paris has been signed, and we now have a new nation. And we learn this during the time that His Excellency George Washington is with us. And we will see him one more time in April of 1789, where our new nation is started. And he's been elected our first president. And he's on his way to New York to be inaugurated. And he stops through the village on his way from Mount Vernon to go to his inauguration. These are exciting times in Kingston. To walk where the Patriots have been, to be where His Excellency was on his horse, and to be able to feel that spirit and to see these patriots who have led us. Some of them are from Kingston. Matter of fact, there's at least 5. There's Captain Joachim Gulick and two or three of his relatives, and William Bastido, who was born in South Brunswick. He's a farmer and he's a member of the New Jersey militia. And you know what's nice about the militia? When the harvest is time, or it's time to plant, they get furlough and they leave and they go do the planting and they do the harvesting. And so Mr. Bastido comes back and forth in town. But did you know he's a scout for the Battle of Monmouth? And on July 4th, 1776, I find out from him that he's standing guard duty in Perth Amboy. Little did he know what was happening on that day. But these are good times. We now see it's 1804 when the new turnpike opens just east of the village, and it takes traffic away from us. But we do have hope because Major John Gulick and some other prominent citizens have started the Princeton and Kingston Branch Turnpike. And we're hoping it brings more traffic back into the village so that we can have our taverns working again. It's been a little bit of a lull. We're hoping soon that this will happen. I know one man that thinks it will is Phineas Withington, because he's arrived just this year and he has big plans for a tavern. Matter of fact, he has plans of putting his own fish pond on his property so that he can get fresh trout and other country fish to serve to his diners at any time. So these are exciting times. And I am so delighted to be here with you today. And I would invite you to come and visit me in Kingston and walk the path of the Patriots. And I can point out some of the homes and some of the taverns that exist. And again, I thank you for your time, and I remain your humble servant.
Ladies and gentlemen, many of you already know that our first-person presenter, as he would be called, is George Luck, Jr., and you had already seen him in the videotape as a long-standing fireman in Kingston. He also is the gentleman that posted the signs, if you've driven through Kingston and seen them. This is the path of the Continental Army. So his interest in this isn't just for today. And George, thank you ever so much. That was just wonderful. Okay.
I don't know how anyone tops that. That was really excellent. But I know you've seen a lot about Kingston today, and I had to try to figure out something that might be a little bit different. Since I started with a slideshow that became the wonderful video and became much more than what I did, I decided to show you a little bit about Kingston then and now. I'm going to show some old photographs. Some of the old historic photographs are from the 1880s, 1900s, early 1900s to about 1940, and try to show you the comparable place today. And I will be brief. I'm going to sit down because I'm going to work both of the slide projectors. Okay, Kingston then and now. As you can see on the left, this is Main Street as it looked in 1900. This is the old Kingston Highway, and it's leading, this is Main Street right at the intersection of Academy and Church. Those two indentions right in the center of the photograph. Church Street goes to the right. That is the Presbyterian Cemetery up on the hill where George saw General Washington on his conference on horseback, and of course leading down to the canal area. On the right is the same hill looking from the other direction into Kingston today. This is Main Street in the same general direction. As you can see, it's quite a bit different today than it was in 1900. This is looking, well, it's looking in actually two different directions. This is just general Main Street, 1900 and today. Again, 1900, dirt Main Street. That is the beautiful tree that you see on the right-hand side in the black and white photograph. Just next to it is the Union Line Hotel. On the right-hand side is the Union Line Hotel as it stands today. J.S. Wolfe was a boot and shoemaker, and he operated a small retail operation just in the house that you see right there on the corner of Laurel and Main Street. His son also operated a store, and it was also the post office. And you see the house next to, on the right-hand side, on the right-hand frame is the same place. In 1904, Luther Anthony operated a store on Main Street in Laurel. In the 1930s, B.S. Peoples did, same place. You'll note that the sycamore tree is still there because on the right-hand side, just recently, this is the home of Main Street Cafe. That's Mr. Jimmy McDonald in the photograph and Kingston's famous dog known as Mavis. This is an interesting shot. The one on the left was the Kingston Garden Restaurant. It was on Main Street, also known as Lincoln Highway. You will note the building just behind the Kingston restaurant. That was the home of Cornelius Van Dyne. It's the house with the two chimneys you see on the left. Cornelius Van Dyne built a house in the early 1870s. It was listed on the 1876 map as the Van Dyne Manse. The photograph on the right is Good Time Charlie's restaurant. It looks like the same house is standing behind the restaurant, but in fact, the restaurant has incorporated all of these new additions to the house. So the Good Time Charlie's was the Van Dyne Manse, which also became the Brooks Manor. And this is another angle of it. Again, it looks like it's standing behind Good Time Charlie's, but in fact, it is in totally the center of Good Time Charlie's. The Union Line Hotel burned in 1879 and was rebuilt. The photograph on the left is a photograph not long after it was rebuilt, and the one on the right is the Union Line today. Hopefully it'll be fixed up relatively soon. That's another angle of the Union Line. Note the soot on the side is from the trucks going by because everything was built very close to Heathcote Road. Next door to the Union Line Hotel was, oddly enough, the Union Garage. And this was operated by the Messick family for many, many years. It is now being renovated for some sort of office space. Kingston Volunteer Fire Company needs no introduction. On the left, you see the 1939 and 1924 trucks. Many of you may recognize the 1939 truck. The Kingston Fire Department uses that regularly, brings it out for parades and special occasions. The building on the right was added lately in the 1970s, I believe. 3 generations of Stewart family have run and operated a garage business on Main Street and Academy Street. The photograph on the left is 1929, and probably that's Benjamin Stewart in the doorway, and Kingston Garage as it stands today. George mentioned the Beehive Tavern. This is a tavern that was located, we think, in this particular spot. But this is nonetheless an old building that we believe was a tavern. It was certainly run as an inn, and it was torn down sometime later and replaced by the current building you see on the right. It houses today's Kingston Post Office, which was built in 1966. This is Main Street and Academy, and the other side is Church Street in Franklin. The Bayless family was a prominent family in Kingston. He operated a stage line And although the photograph on the left says the Gulick House, it is actually the Bayless House. And this is, was known as Fair Acres, and many of you may know the development of Fair Acres. This is directly on Main Street, and there's a new condominium development that was built up behind it. The Fair Acres homestead is in process of renovation. This is about an 1840 house. Jedediah Higgins, who supposedly bought his land for a sow and her litter, this is where his homestead was. This is on Main Street, right near Raymond Road, at the intersection of Raymond Road. The oldest part of the house does date back to 1714, and today it's a Chinese antique place. This is the old Withington homestead. I believe Robert told you a great deal about that. And we have some really interesting additional photographs of the Withington homestead. This is the driveway on the left through the gates looking towards Main Street. The photograph on the right is from Main Street looking towards the gates. They had a very long drive leading to their estate, and it was called, today's street is called Spruce Street because you see the large, beautiful spruce trees lined the driveway that led to this majestic entrance. These are the gardens, part of the gardens and front driveway of Withington. And although I don't have a corresponding family playing croquet today, this is the Withington family playing croquet on their lawn in 1881. Old photographs, many of these old photographs were taken with a large 8x10 format camera, which flattened the picture quite a bit and also gave you a much larger panorama. And that's what you see on the left. That is the Fisk Grocery Store, which is on the far left, which is now the Wine Press Restaurant. You see the lock tender's house beside it in the background, the White House. The triangle structure in the middle was the swing bridge. It today has been replaced by the permanent bridge. If you look on the picture on the right, you see the lock tender's house and the permanent pavement bridge that went over that. On the old photograph, the hotel on the right-hand side is the Hoffman House that did burn down in 1910. The Four Arch Bridge, which was built in 1798, this was the bridge that was rebuilt after George Washington and his troops burned it to stop the pursuit of Cornwallis. In the photograph on the left, you can see some of the townscape of Kingston in the background, the steeple of the church and some of the buildings. I tried to get this exact photograph, but it is so dense with vegetation and trees now, it's not quite possible. But the bridge still looks pretty decent. We've heard a great deal about the mill. The mill on the left was, this photograph was taken just not too long after it was rebuilt in 1889. This is the mill that stands today on the right-hand side and is a private residence. As part of their compensation for being a lock tender and working for the DNR Canal, the lock tender was provided a home. This was the lock tender's home approximately, 1910 or so. And this is how it looks today on the right. The small structure to the right of the lock tender's house on the left is called the toll house. This is the toll house today. And the toll house also was the home where they put the telegraph in, and Kingston was one of the first places they had the telegraph along the canal. The interesting thing about the telegraph is they used it originally to communicate about water levels and things like that, but it became a very important tool for alerting the next toll tender about the people that were running the tolls, just like the turnpike. This is a view of, the gentleman is sitting on what was the swing bridge. You can see the triangle shape around him. That was a lock tender. His name was Riccadone, and it's the same view from the other side from the permanent paved road. Kingston had a railroad, And this was the railroad house. And it was positioned between the canal and what is now the Woodwinds operation. What's interesting about this, you can see the lock tender's house in the background on both photographs, but also there are a number of trees that still exist today, and those are the trees there on the right. However, virtually nothing exists of the railroad except that rusty sign on the right-hand side next to the bridge. The toll tender was not provided a house. He had to live wherever he could. And the last toll taker was a gentleman named John McFowle, and he lived on the bluff overlooking the canal. It was a Van Dyne house. Van Dyne also had what is now Good Time Charlie's. He also ran a general store and post office, which is now the Wine Press restaurant. This house is just up the hill from the Wine Press restaurant, and this is how the house looks today. And if any of you are wondering, this is where Mavis lives. The boat basin at Kingston was a very busy place. You can see the boats stacked up here. Many times they came over here just to wait to go their turn through the lock. Other times they just came to load and unload. And of course, probably most of the time they came just to enjoy Kingston's many taverns and inns. Today it's a very peaceful, beautiful place along the DNR State Canal. The Presbyterian Church was built in 1878. This picture was taken prior to 1900. We're not sure of the date. Church Street, you can see, is a dirt road, and the church as it stands today. The Presbyterian Church you have heard a great deal about already, but this is the newest church that was built in 1852. You can see the date over the door. This was the original site of the church in 1723, the Presbyterian Cemetery. This is the oldest grave marked in the cemetery. It is that of Deborah Leonard. She died in 1756, and she was the wife of Whitehead Leonard. There were possibly other older graves in the cemetery, possibly some Quaker graves or possibly even some Revolutionary soldiers in unmarked graves. And two people you've heard quite a bit about today. On the left is the gravesite of Phineas Withington. On the right is William Van Tilburg. The photograph on the left is an aerial view of Kingston that was taken around 1961. You can see in the center the Presbyterian Church is almost the very center of town. On the right is the church manse. It's a spectacular Queen Anne-style house, and it is just to the right of the church on the left-hand side. Just down, I don't really have a pointer, but if you come down from the church, three major buildings, there's a squarish building, that is Lou's Barber Shop, and that was, of course, where J.S. Wolfe and George Wolfe had the bootmaker shop and the post office. In the next block, and directly across the street from the Presbyterian Church, this was the home of Withington. The Withington Tavern was actually a wooden building, a wooden structure that stood behind this building. This building was added later in the 1800s. And unfortunately, the wooden structure is totally disappearing. You can see the new addition that's going on in the back that totally decimated the old wooden structure where the tavern was. Just down the street, the house in the next block on the aerial view, the large white house, this is what's called now the New School of Music, and it's located on Main Street and Shaw Drive. And directly behind Lou's was where the Wolfe family butcher had a business. It is now a personal residence, but Raymond Wolfe was the butcher. He operated out of the front of it, and the family lived upstairs. And of course, Kingston had an undertaker, and he was known as Mr. J. Shan, and he was a wheelwright and the undertaker. And in the front of the house was the parlor, and the family lived upstairs and in the back of the house. And this was located on Euclid Avenue. One of Kingston's more famous people was a gentleman named Charles B. Moore. And Charles Moore was a Kingston businessman who was very successful. He owned a hay press, he owned a coal and lumber yard, and he operated a farm. Well, this is number 4 Academy Street, and this is where he operated his hay press. This building was built around 1870. He went on to become a state senator. He was elected in 1875, and later he went on to serve as a superintendent for New Jersey prisons. He lived down the street. This is just a couple doors down on Academy. It's number 10 Academy. And also on the 1876 map, it's listed as the J.B. Moore House, which is the son of Charles B. It is one of the most beautiful and well-preserved historic homes in Kingston. And with this, we conclude, and we thank you very much. This is a little bit of history of Kingston then and now. I hope you enjoyed George and Mr. von Zumbush and our video. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann. May I see, by a show of hands, if anybody learned anything today? Wow, that's impressive. Too bad you couldn't get that, Tasso. No. Would I have been remiss in not bringing these people to the community? I think so. We've had 2 presentations now. We've had 6 presenters. All of them have been excellent. And our next presentation will be on April 22nd, which is 2 weeks from today, I believe. Isn't it? I think so. And Dr. Joan Luckhart and Dr. Richard Ilnicki will present on the Dayton area of town. Dr. Joan has been very active in saving the Slack House from desecration, and Dr. Ilnicki will give us a presentation on what made South Brunswick such a magnet for farming, by explaining to us that we have soil that not only is very rich, but is almost unique in the world. South Brunswick. Imagine that? And he knows a lot more about that than I do, and he will be here to tell us about that. I hope that you'll join us on that day, and I hope that you will reach out to people in the community who are new to the community, because that was one of my objectives in doing this. I hate to think that with all the many people who have come into South Brunswick recently, they just come here and they really don't know what a rich history we have and how many talented people we have in the community. So please help me in that effort. If anyone hasn't received the handout for today, this wonderful timeline that Ann put together with a brief history of Kingston on the back is for you, but we would ask that you limit it to 1 per family. Is there anything else that I have to tell you? There probably is, but I can't remember. So once again, I thank you, and I thank our presenters, and please join us again.